in the case of Taiwan, there has been a fair amount of anxiety, I would say, over US commitments. That anxiety precedes the strike on Iran. On the one hand, the Trump administration's focus on another part of the world creates a fair amount of anxiety in the region. On the other, this show of US strength and decisiveness probably shores up some confidence in the US, though I would add that it probably also depends on the ally and partner that you're speaking to. There would be some concern in the region over whether such an action could actually engender more confrontation with China rather than prevent one.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion, considering the ways that the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facilities back on June 22nd is shaping thinking about deterrence in the Taiwan Strait and influencing how regional stakeholders think about security more broadly. We have two fantastic experts with us here today. Their full bios can be found on the National Committee's website, so I will just introduce them briefly now. First, we have Taylor Fravel, who is the Arthur and Ruth Sloan Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Security Studies Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And we also have Amanda Hsiao, who is a Director in the Asia Group's China practice, covering China's foreign policy and cross-strait relations. And I'm your moderator for today's session. My name is Jennifer Staats, and I'm Associate Director of the RAND China Research Center and a Senior Political Scientist at RAND. So with that, let's dive right in. Taylor, I'll go to you first to start us off, taking a step back to talk a little bit about the strategic significance of this U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. As we know, this was not a strike designed to stop an imminent attack, but was rather an effort to prevent Iran from further developing its nuclear capabilities. So what kind of signal does this send to the world about U.S. willingness to use military force, and how is it being interpreted in other parts of the world?
Great, thank you. I mean, it was quite a significant event and a watershed moment, perhaps, in coercive diplomacy more broadly defined. I mean, very rarely has a state conducted a preventive strike on another state's nuclear arsenal or its nascent nuclear arsenal. Historically, states have thought a lot about doing this. In fact, the United States considered attacking China's nuclear arsenal in the early 1960s. There's a great article on this, but it rarely, if ever, happens. And so in that sense, it, I think, was a watershed moment. Additionally, it was a strike on Iran, which has been talked about in the United States, but has sort of not come to fruition. I think the attack itself, though, was the product of some unique circumstances, which begs broader questions about how frequently this might sort of reoccur in the future, and perhaps also how some states responded to it. So the attack occurred after a series of Israeli strikes on Iranian air defenses from October of 2024 and then in the weeks preceding the U.S. strike itself, such that essentially Israel had decimated the entire Iranian integrated air defense system, such that it was relatively safe for U.S. planes to fly over Iranian airspace and to conduct the attack. Those circumstances, right, are really important because they were the enabling condition then for the decision as to whether or not to take advantage of those circumstances. But I don't think those circumstances are going to be a common feature of international politics or of other moments or issues where perhaps there is a strong preventive motivation, right? So in other words, right, the U.S. did not itself undertake, weeks-long or months-long efforts to degrade the Iranian air defenses before conducting this strike. It took advantage of something that Israel had done and then had a unique weapon system, these deep penetrating bombs that were sort of, in fact, designed for destroying very hard and deeply buried nuclear facilities such as those that were attacked. So I think that would be my take on kind of the context and how to then think about what the implications are. And I actually think they're kind of limited in a very narrow sense. In a broader sense, though, it certainly suggested less inhibitions on the part of this administration for using force against other countries. So in that sense, I think the strike does carry implications for how other states might think about the willingness of the United States to use military force in this administration under certain conditions. But again, I think the conditions were one where there was relatively low risk to U.S. forces and a potentially very high payoff in setting back Iran's nuclear program. Thank you.
Thanks. Amanda, will go to you. As Taylor said, countries around the world are watching and trying to understand what this action by the United States means for global security dynamics and their own national interests. So I'm curious if you can kind of take us to China and help us understand the view from Beijing. How have China's leaders interpreted this strike? And more specifically, how might this shape China's future strategy toward Taiwan or Beijing's broader understanding of U.S. strategy in East Asia?
Thanks, Jennifer. And it's really great to be included in this event with the both of you. Now, Beijing's official response to the strikes was to, of course, condemn the strikes and to try to leverage the incident to bolster its own sort of moral authority vis-a-vis the US. But when we think about how Beijing understood the strike in terms of its own posture in the Asia Pacific and vis-a-vis Taiwan, I think it confirmed a couple of assumptions that the Chinese already had of Trump, and that at the end of the day, those assumptions net out from the perspective of deterrence. So what I mean by that is, on the one hand, the Trump administration's continued focus on other parts of the world gives Beijing more confidence that he is not going to be doing much to move the dial in China's backyard in the Indo-Pacific. Since the start of this term, we've seen that Trump has not only been focused on the Middle East, but also he's been quite preoccupied with reaching a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine and in America's own backyard in Latin America. But on the other hand, Trump's decision to strike Iran suggests a few things that I think from the Chinese perspective will be unsettling. I think it confirms that the president is unpredictable and mercurial, and that he is both willing, but also can politically succeed from reversing his foreign policy positions. So on Iran, Trump and his base were largely against more US intervention in the Middle East and taking direct military action. There was considerable debate within the right on this decision, but he made that decision nevertheless. I think it also shows that the president is willing to use limited force to achieve his objectives. Of course, this isn't new, but this readiness shown on the part of Trump to use force, our collective inability to read Trump's next moves, I think reinforces for Beijing that the range of possible scenarios under a Trump administration when we talk about Taiwan is just much wider than under a more traditional administration. And I think this will tend to breed more cautiousness on the part of China, including deterring Beijing from the highest end military actions on Taiwan. But I do want to emphasize that I think the strike was really just another data point for how China views the Trump administration and its resolve. It doesn't fundamentally change the Chinese perception that Trump sees the Taiwan issue as an element of US-China relations and not as a separate issue unto itself. And the Chinese, of course, continue to have the perception that Trump is fundamentally transactional about Taiwan, as he is with really every other issue. And those perceptions have been informed over time by comments he's made in the first administration, actions he's taken, not just this one strike.
Thanks so much. Taylor, let's stay with the view from Beijing for just a second. You had an essay in Foreign Affairs over the summer looking at China's military readiness and the impact that some of Xi's recent purges may have on that readiness. So with that as the broader background or context, can you tell us how the PLA today is thinking about a potential Taiwan contingency and what these internal political changes in China might tell us about Beijing's ambitions or constraints?
Sure. I think sort of to recap the piece a little bit, right? There's been an unprecedented purge of senior officers in the People's Liberation Army, most notably reflected in the removal or disappearance of 3 of the 6 uniformed members of the Central Military Commission, which is the party's top decision-making body for military affairs roughly over the last 2 years. Li Shangfu, Miao Hua, and most recently He Weidong. He Weidong has only disappeared from view. He's not yet disappeared from kind of the name list, as it were, but I think everyone expects eventually he will also be formally removed from the Central Military Commission. And this is really quite unprecedented. Now, the size of the CMC over the years has waxed and waned. I mean, it was in the 40s and the 50s in terms of membership in the height of the Cultural Revolution. It's also been very small, but never before has kind of half of the leadership been vacated from their positions, right? And this has much broader implications for how we might think about assessing the readiness of the PLA to undertake the missions that have been assigned to it. So I think in a narrow sense, the purges build on a point that Amanda just made about inducing caution in Chinese decisions to use force, especially to use large-scale force, because of concerns about the quality of equipment, about command and control arrangements, and many other factors that might suggest now is not a good time, right, to undertake major military action if you don't actually have much of your high command in place. I think in terms of how the PLA thinks about Taiwan more specifically, the fundamental sort of orientation on Taiwan, right, as what is sometimes referred to in Chinese military strategies, the main strategic direction has not changed. It clearly, I think, is the pacing scenario for a lot of the modernization of the PLA's combat capabilities that we saw on quite vivid display in the parade that was held in Beijing. And if you were to look at some of the systems that came out, right, there's a lot of emphasis on maritime systems, on manned maritime vehicles, anti-ship missiles, and then also a much broader emphasis on missiles more generally. And if one thinks about where these would be deployed and how these systems would be used, right, they'd be, along China's maritime periphery. And of course, the scenario that is the most significant there is Taiwan. And so in that sense, I think there probably hasn't been a change in focus on the PLA undertaking preparations to provide options to Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders for some kind of action around Taiwan when they're called upon to do so, despite the fact that the PLA leadership is going through this very significant upheaval.
Great. So Amanda, I'll come to you now to kind of put some of these threads together and maybe say a few words about what preventive military action might look like in a Taiwan scenario. How should we think about these developments in the PLA, the security dynamics in the region, the tensions between Beijing and Taipei, and what all this might mean going forward?
Yeah, just to jump off of where Taylor left things, we've been talking about the sort of impact of this strike on Iran. And just to sort of reiterate, the long-term fundamentals of Chinese strategy hasn't changed. And it continues to be that Beijing prefers to, as they would say, win without fighting. There continues to be a determination to take over Taiwan, but also to do it at lowest possible cost. And so when we think about preventative military action then in Taiwan, I think that any US administration would have to be a lot more cautious about taking preventative action against China as compared to Iran, China being the most important bilateral relationship for the US and being a much more capable adversary with the potential to hit back and to escalate. So if we're talking about something short of an invasion, for instance, a lot of the focus has really been on the possibility of China conducting a quarantine around Taiwan, for instance, in which Chinese military assets and Coast Guard assets are actively involved in the blocking of energy imports to Taiwan. In such a scenario where it is clear that it's not the prelude to an invasion, but high-end coercive action, the Trump administration could choose to engage in a military response that seeks to break the blockade with the aim of preventing China from escalating further, or to simply demonstrate US resolve and to assure Taiwan that the US has its back and to encourage the Taiwanese to continue to stand up to Chinese coercion. So that's a scenario that could potentially play out. But I also wanted just to talk about the fact that, of course, Taiwan faces constant military pressures every day from the Chinese and the occasional, very loud, very large-scale military exercise. So when we think about preventative action there, really the tools that are most effective might not be military tools in response to everyday Chinese pressures. A lot of that preventative response is going to lie in the diplomatic and legal realms. So the Trump administration could, for instance, consider developing greater internal clarity over the types of Chinese coercion that really impair US interests and the thresholds of Chinese pressures that really should trigger a more robust US response. One of the dilemmas that the US faces is knowing what threshold is a more robust US response necessary from the perspective of escalation prevention. Just to the point on non-military tools, I think we should remember that a piece of what China is trying to do is really to erode resolve in Taiwan. So to combat that sort of effort, a lot of the tools are going to lie in the information sphere. So continued transparency over what China is doing around Taiwan, but not just in the military realm, but on the legal side, on the political side, on the economic side as well. And I would just finally add on to that, strengthening coordination with allies, having allies also speak out more about not just the risks of an invasion, but also about the sort of everyday coercion that Taiwan is dealing with, and a number of other allies are also dealing with as well.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Taylor, Amanda just finished by outlining really this broad range of tools that China has at its disposal. At the extreme end of that spectrum, of course, is its nuclear capabilities. And so I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how these developments relate to what you have described as an emerging nuclear conventional security dilemma. We know that China is working to modernize its military nuclear forces. As you mentioned, the parade earlier this week put that on full display, really showcasing for the first time China's ability to launch nuclear warheads from land, sea, and air. So what should we make of all of this?
So, yeah, this has been a fascinating week for those of us who are interested in China's strategic and nuclear forces. As you mentioned, right, in the parade, 3 new systems were displayed, one of which I think was quite surprising. But the first was a new air-launched nuclear-capable ballistic missile. In other words, a ballistic missile that you could attach to a bomber and then send the bomber out and then launch the missile from the bomber. Not an ICBM or not intercontinental in range. I think it was described by the announcer at the parade as a long-range missile. Then the other 2 were also quite significant, but most notably, I think there was a new missile, the DF-61 or the Dongfeng 61, which caught a number of observers by surprise because it seems to be the successor to a missile that was only revealed maybe 5 years ago called the Dongfeng 41. This appears to be a road mobile, very large system, perhaps according to Jane's defense industry, right, capable of going as far as 18,000 kilometers, so greater in range than any other Chinese system. But I would also caution that we don't yet know the full details, right, of this missile because it was still in its canister. In other words, the transporter, erector, launcher vehicle was in the parade with the canister, but we don't know if the missile was in the canister. And we certainly didn't get a chance to see the missile. And then, of course, they displayed a new variant of a submarine-launched ballistic missile. Finally, they also displayed the missile that appears as if it will be going into the new silo fields that were built between 2020 and 2022. And this is a somewhat shorter range missile from the DF-31 series. So I think what this all means is that China is fully committed to achieving its goals of expanding and modernizing its nuclear forces. So not just increasing the number of warheads, which receives a lot of attention, but also the sophistication and diversity of its delivery vehicles, right? So the fact that, as was noted in the parade, they can now launch from air, land, and sea, but primarily it's the sea and the land legs that are the most important here because of the somewhat limited range of the air-launched ballistic missile system. In some ways, some of the dynamics that I talked about a few years ago in terms of this nuclear conventional security dilemma might just be morphing into a much more traditional nuclear security dilemma. The conventional dynamics, I think, are still important, but what we are seeing here is a real full commitment on the part of China to becoming a formidable nuclear power. This, I think, has several purposes in mind, although it's important to note that, at least from my view, we just can't infer kind of Chinese intentions from Chinese systems without sort of a better understanding of the doctrine and the ideas that sort of inform that doctrine. On the other hand, with sort of fewer opportunities to talk to knowledgeable Chinese interlocutors about these issues and far fewer kind of materials that we can consult, of course, this is sort of very difficult to do. But at a minimum, I think, right, this is part of a buildup with Taiwan in mind in one and potentially more senses. But in the first sense, I think China wanted to be in a position where if there was a war across the Taiwan Strait or some other major military action, it would have a force that would be clearly capable of deterring any U.S. use of nuclear weapons against China, even a limited use of nuclear weapons, which had been talked about in kind of the second half of the 2010s and was also associated with some officials who were in the first Trump administration. Additionally, these new systems could give China the ability, if it so choose, right, to engage in its own potential limited first use as part of an effort to deter the United States or to shape conditions on the battlefield. That would be more of a departure for China's approach to nuclear weapons in the past. And again, in terms of what I said before, one cannot necessarily conclude from the fact that China has this new theater range air-launched ballistic missile that is the purpose, because that would also be a weapon that China could threaten to use in retaliation to a U.S. limited first strike. But nevertheless, right, the ability, right, for China to do more at the nuclear level is being reflected in all of these new weapon systems. And then finally, going back to our previous discussion about corruption, right, corruption in the rocket force is actually a really big deal. What led to the downfall of Li Shangfu and so forth, and yet a lot of new rocket force systems were on display, and a lot of new missile systems were on display. So at one level, China may be seeking to sort of counteract perceptions that somehow its nuclear forces were significantly sort of set back by these sort of corruption episodes and so forth. Yet on the other hand, as I mentioned, right, we didn't see the missile itself.
Terrific. Thank you. We're getting low on time, so I'm going to ask you each one more question, really zooming back out again, thinking about the implications of this U.S. strike in June. And Amanda, to you first, thinking about the implications for the region. How does the U.S. strike against Iran affect the credibility of U.S. commitments to Taiwan and to other U.S. allies in Asia? And does this attack shape the way that other countries think about America's willingness to be militarily engaged in the region or use military force?
Similar to what I was trying to say about perceptions in Beijing, I think the strike is really just a single data point as well in terms of the extent to which it will form the perception of Taiwan and U.S. allies in Asia. So, right, on the one hand, the Trump administration's focus on another part of the world creates a fair amount of anxiety in the region. On the other, this show of U.S. strength and decisiveness probably shores up some confidence in the U.S., though I would add that it probably also depends on the ally and partner that you're speaking to, right? There would be some concern in the region over whether such an action could actually engender more confrontation with China rather than prevent one. But there are a lot of other important factors that shape regional perceptions of U.S. resolve. The phrasing of U.S. statements on longstanding issues, those are parsed very carefully by allies and partners. U.S. political responses to evolving developments. Is there a U.S. statement made in response to the latest Chinese military exercise around Taiwan, U.S. military presence across the region? Partners and allies track that as well. But also under this term and under both really Trump administrations, the U.S. approach to allies and partners in the trade realm will also have a bit of a spillover effect into perceptions of U.S. commitments and credibility. I would just add that in the case of Taiwan, there has been a fair amount of anxiety, I would say, over U.S. commitments. That anxiety precedes the strike on Iran. It's a result of Trump's initial comments about Taiwan needing to step up more in return for U.S. security guarantees, about Taiwan stealing U.S. semiconductors, how difficult it is to defend Taiwan, et cetera. And that anxiety has been compounded further with a couple of recent events, the administration deciding to stop ongoing discussions about a potential transit by Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te to the U.S., the inability of the U.S. and Taiwan to reach a final trade deal. So those actions, those statements, I think have a much greater impact on Taiwanese perceptions of the U.S. And it's further compounded by the fact that the Trump administration is, of course, pursuing a trade deal with China and a summit with Xi. So Taipei is going to be closely watching those developments on the U.S.-China front, and in particular, what Trump may say about Taiwan out of a potential summit.
Thanks. And Taylor, the last question to you, really thinking about this all in the big picture, what precedent does this June strike set for the future of U.S. global military interventions? And how should the American public think about or understand the evolving role of preventive force in U.S. strategy?
Thanks. My view at the moment is it doesn't really set a precedent in the following sense, going back to my kind of assessment of how it unfolded, which is to say, it was just this really unique moment where the costs were low and the payoff was really high. In other words, the United States didn't carry a lot of direct risk of escalation as a result of this particular attack from Iran. Now, of course, it may have a very significant impact on the future of U.S.-Iranian relations and everything else sort of down the road. But in the moment, I think it was pretty limited, which is probably why it was authorized to go forward. Again, I think previous administrations have talked about the potential of this kind of action, always kind of shied away from doing so. So in that sense, I don't think it sets a precedent yet. Of course, whether or not it sets a precedent is probably determined by the fact of whether or not a similar strike again occurs in some relatively short period of time. I think it was just a product of an opportunity that arose and a unique capability that the United States possessed. And I think more broadly, right, if we're zooming out to Taiwan and what, this is building upon Amanda's excellent comments, but right, one cannot really imagine a scenario across the Taiwan Strait where the U.S. might consider, right, a preventive strike on a Chinese capability of some kind, because China is such a formidable military power already. One could conceive of, preemptive strike on the cusp of war to, take out a critical weapon system or something of that nature, but that's a very different, right, category of action where essentially the political decision to go to war has been made, and it's just about kind of gaining that first mover advantage. These preventive uses of force are very, very different in my view. But this idea of opportunism is, I think, is somewhat consistent with this administration's approach more generally, whereby there's been efforts to be involved in different regional conflicts and try to achieve quick victories, as we saw with the somewhat dramatic meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska, which now seems like it was a very long time ago, because not much really has changed in Ukraine, even though there was a sense that maybe there was an opportunity to do something. Now that's not the same as a preventive use of force, but I think does at least reflect this idea of seizing opportunities where they're available and then kind of moving on to the next issue or crisis of the week or the day. So I think that's how I would think about this question of precedent. To paraphrase Zhou Enlai, right, in 1971, when asked about the French Revolution, he said it was too soon to tell. So perhaps it's too soon to tell yet as to whether or not this has established a precedent as well. Thank you.
Fair enough. We'll have to have another discussion in a few months to see if we have any new insights. But this was great. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But thank you so much, Taylor and Amanda, for sharing your thoughts and insights. I certainly learned a lot. And thank you to the National Committee for hosting and organizing this event. A special thanks to the National Committee staff who have been working very hard behind the scenes to bring this all together and make it possible. We hope that those of you who joined us today have found this informative, and invite you to tune in to other National Committee programming in the future. Thank you again for joining us.